I just want to invite people to go, you don't have to step into that label. If that feels disempowering, which I think most labels do, don't own it. Go with, like you said, I mean, I don't have to name this. And now how do I live with this forever? Because it's a fixed state I can never recover from.
Yeah, this is now me.
This is me.
This is something I'm going through.
Exactly. Like how you put it, holistic healing. How do I heal from this? I can acknowledge it and recognize it as a challenge in this season of my life. I don't have to own it. The U.S. has reached peak therapy. Counseling has become fodder for hit books, podcasts, and movies. Professional athletes, celebrities, and politicians routinely go public with their mental health struggles. And everyone is talking, correctly or not, in the language of therapy, peppering conversations with references to gaslighting, toxic people, and boundaries. All this mainstream awareness is reflected in the data, too. By the latest federal estimates, about 1 in 8 U.S. adults now takes an antidepressant, and 1 in 5 has recently received some kind of mental health care, an increase of almost 15 million people in treatment since 2002. Even in the recent past, from 2019 to 2022, use of mental health services jumped by almost 40% among millions of U.S. adults with commercial insurance, according to a recent study in JAMA Health Forum. But something isn't adding up. Even as more people flock to therapy, U.S. mental health is getting worse by multiple metrics. Suicide rates have risen by about 30% since 2000. Almost a third of U.S. adults now report symptoms of either depression or anxiety, roughly 3 times as many as in 2019. And about 1 in 25 adults has a serious mental illness like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. As of late 2022, just 31% of U.S. adults considered their mental health excellent, down from 43% 2 decades earlier. Trends are going in the wrong direction even as more people seek care. Quote, that's not true for cancer survival. It's not true for heart disease survival. It's not true for diabetes diagnosis or almost any other area of medicine, says Dr. Thomas Insel, the psychiatrist who ran the National Institute of Mental Health from 2002 to 2015. And he's the author of Healing, Our Path from Mental Illness to Mental Health. He goes on to say, how do you explain that disconnect? And then there's some graphs and there's some more to this, but I think that's enough to really kind of speak to this, Elliott. I think as professionals in the field and people who obviously care deeply about Americans, community members, family members, friends' mental health.
Even non-Americans.
Yeah, all of y'all. But just since the data was referring to
US.
The data were. That's actually a plural word, FYI.
Thank you.
Yes, learned that in grad school. So the data were referring to Americans' mental health. What do you think about this? Obviously, COVID, we can even put that on the side or integrate it into the conversation. But I do think it's quite troubling. And I think it's multifaceted. But when you read something like that or hear something like that, what is your response?
Boy, a lot, because that was a lot of information. But one of the kind of sociological or cultural phenomenons is when we know something, it changes something, right? The smoking numbers, for example, used to be way higher than they are now as far as just smoking cigarettes. Then we finally recognized what many people suspected, that it was truly horrible for us. Companies had been hiding the facts behind it and everything else, and then smoking went way down. And now I can't think of anybody in America anyway, or at least majority of people in America who would smoke under some kind of semblance of an idea that it's not bad for them.
Right.
So in the reverse trend then, the beauty of being much more aware of mental health with Millennial and Gen Z is fantastic, but also creates kind of almost a cultural phenomenon now to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
What's the word I'm looking like? In a blithy manner? What's that word I'm looking for?
Blase?
Yeah, maybe blase is right, but that's not quite what I was saying about. I meant in almost like a flippant manner. Maybe you can just say that.
Yeah, let's go with flippant.
And just use the language and the vernacular. And I think I've used this example before. Many students nowadays, when I meet them during orientation weekend, and I'm already ready for that, Tim. It's already been too long. I'm just ready to get the kids back. I've had enough break.
You've
Let's
had
get
like
going.
a week and a half off.
That's good. I'm ready.
Aw.
In orientation, I'm often, especially when they know I teach psychology or I'm a counselor, if I'm introduced that way, I'll get diagnostic before I get what their major is.
Mm-hmm.
Or what their hobbies are or their passions. First papers, in my classes are often just an introductory self-awareness disclosure, just to kind of help prime them and into what's coming in my classes, which are kind of self-discovery, analysis, integration, application work. I'll get way more about that field now. It's 90 to 10 that compared to when you were a student of mine. It'd have been 5% to 95% the facts. I'm from Cincinnati. I'm the youngest sister of 2 older brothers. My dad and mom are teachers. Those kind of things now come secondary. It would be like the papers nowadays would start out like, well, I was diagnosed with major anxiety in 3rd grade, and just they go right into the identification and the labeling. So as much as I'm glad for mental health awareness and mental health documentation and recognition, it's created a complete flip of the perspective, understanding, and depth.
We are thrilled to announce our partnership with Authentics Athletic Apparel, spelled with 2 X's at the end because it's our XX chromosomes that make us female. And contrary to current belief, no amount of hormones, no number of surgeries can change that. And no female athlete should have to compete against men. But at the moment, this is exactly what's happening in both amateur and professional sports. It's not fair, nor is it safe. Wearing Authentics lets us take a stand to support and protect female athletes. And I don't think it's hyperbolic to say it. We're protecting the future of womanhood. Authentics gives 10% of all sales to the Independent Women's Forum, the nonprofit which fights for women's causes, including our right to our own spaces and our right to compete against other women and only other women. Check out Authentics.com and use promo code LOVELIFE for 10% off your purchase. That's Authentics.com, AUTHENTIXX.com, and use promo code LOVELIFE, all one word, for 10% off your purchase. So we have more mental health awareness and also more people unhappy and anxious and
Almost creating, that's what I'm saying. It's almost creating its own movement.
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes. And just the idea that shouldn't I have something? I think middle schoolers and high schools assume they have an issue beyond normal adolescence. And if your other friends have nervousness or fear and they label it anxiety and then get on an anti-anxiety med or something in that regard, then it almost becomes as popular as getting a Lululemon shirt. You go get a prescription from a doctor.
So I'm going to take the position then that all this awareness isn't necessarily all that helpful. And let's also give a real world application, another real, that's a hard thing to say, real world application. We have all these depression screenings. I remember when I was a professor at Concordia, the depression screening. Hey, everyone go to the quad, go to the commons and get your depression screening. I remember walking by, I'm like, who's funding this? Did the school just take their money and bring all these mental health professionals in to do this diagnostic, to your point? Or is a pharmaceutical company and a big campaign to help all the people figure out if they have depression or not? And we're at college. How anxious and depressed do you think people are? Probably a lot, because they maybe didn't study that hard for their exam, and oops, now they have anxiety about facing that test that they know they're not well prepared for. And wow, they just got broken up with, which, a lot of us did throughout college, and that's going to cause you to be depressed for a while. It's called grieving. But never fear. Eli Lilly is here with their depression screening that they funded, and they're going to get everyone diagnosed with depression and then get themselves some Prozac sales.
Yeah, the demarcation line I use, which is what you're talking about, and then you can go back on your movement there, is situational depression versus psychological depression, or situational anxiety or nervousness rather than psychological or identified anxiety. So I try to help the students understand that there's ebb and flow of life, which will create depression, sadness, grieving, nervousness, apprehension, concern. We can flush out these words way more than just anxiety, depression, right? So I'm just adding that element to it that I think you're right. And so I try to normalize those scenarios. And the students do a good job of changing vernacular if you help them.
But to your point earlier, if at age 9, when I'm in third grade, I'm told I have this anxiety, am I not going to then frame and see my experiences, perceive my experiences, experience my experiences and my emotions through this lens of this is what I have? So now there is no situational, it's chronic. It's always
the lens is now comprehensively connected. That's never too strong. It's rarely variables and situations and circumstances that can warrant. It's not uncommon for clients to come to me and unload on something that is truly horrific and really, really difficult. And I'm not trying to take away from the significance, but rather bring it into a context of the functionality of life and the circle of life. And that's a very delicate matter because you don't want to rob someone, that sounds weird, but rob them of their pain or their suffering, but trying to contextualize in a manner to recognize this is part of the human existence. This is part of the human condition.
Suffering is part of life.
Mm-hmm.
Suffering emotionally, psychologically is part of life.
Yeah, so the mental awareness, if we're saying point one is that mental health awareness is now such a part of our culture and community. Now it's watered down, actually diminished in its importance simply by its popularity.
Exactly. And it's also, to your point, watered down to where people who do have legitimate psychiatric illnesses, like intense, then everyone else is running around. I had a panic attack. No, you didn't. And that's actually not very compassionate to people who really do struggle with such things. And I know it's become part of our vernacular. So people say such things without trying to be hurtful. They're just trying to put a label on their experience. And I understand that, their emotional response. But it's deeper than that. And we've really, to your point, watered down and trivialized. And then on the flip side, also become hyperbolic about this expectation that I should not have any fluctuations in emotions. And should I have a fluctuation in emotion, it means that I am also mentally ill.
Yeah. Or that it's sudden onset. So I'm very careful in my classes like abnormal psychology, which I teach again this fall. Very careful and spend a real 4 or 5 weeks before we get into any of the conditions, any of the disorders, to demystify the whole thing and normalize it and do the very things we're talking about contextually. Because my worst fear for teaching that class is now I've created more labels and more identity issues for students that aren't really appropriate or accurate.
And that's very common when you're taking an abnormal class. I remember even back in high school, I took some intro to psych with Mrs. Behrensfeld. All you boys like yourself some Mrs. Behrensfeld.
Why didn't I get that opportunity?
I don't know. I don't know if they rolled it out between just the couple years between your...
Well, I had intro to psych with a wonderful lady, Mrs. Wrestler, who was really important in helping me move. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But I didn't have Paula. Paula wasn't...
You would have remembered that.
Yes. I didn't get her in any classes. Name. I wasn't in the...
No,
well,
you wouldn't have had her.
We were neighbors.
Well, she was at Clifton Meadows all the time.
That's right.
As you know, we've been partnering with The Wellness Company for several months now. And personally, as someone who sadly no longer trusts the vast majority of medical professionals, I am so happy to be able to share The Wellness Company's array of products with the Love and Life community. Dan and I just purchased The Wellness Company's medical emergency kit, which includes vital medications with proven safety profiles like ivermectin, amoxicillin, and Z-Pak. The kit also includes a comprehensive guidebook researched and written by the company's chief medical board, including esteemed doctors who stood up to COVID tyranny, by the way, which is exactly why they've earned our trust. Dr. Peter McCullough, Dr. Harvey Risch, Dr. Drew Pinsky, and Dr. Paul Alexander, just to name a few. Head over to twc.health/lovelife and enter promo code LOVELIFE, all one word, for 15% off your order. That's twc.health/lovelife and promo code LOVELIFE for 15% off your order. We can take charge of our health, and the Wellness Company is here to help us do it. Anyway, so point number one, to try to address this question of more therapy and everyone's less happy, what's going on? Point number one is mental health awareness may not be doing what it was probably initially. I hope, again, I get cynical because I think a lot of mental health awareness was driven by the psychiatric community via Big Pharma. But as I made that example a moment ago, but to assume that it actually was coming from a pure place, mental health awareness would have tried to normalize such conditions. And yet this huge movement in our culture that's quite different from, as you were saying, from even Gen X versus millennials. There was an enormous push to raise mental health awareness, destigmatize mental health. This has some unintended consequences that is probably related to why we are having more and more therapy and we're actually less emotionally well.
Yeah, a second point is I think it is based on pharmaceutical / medical field, the heightened sense, and this is based in the insurance game too, that needing to diagnose and officialize in the DSM in order to activate the insurance, in order to pay for the medicine, creates then an over-identification with over-diagnostic labels. And whether the person's 13 or 33, in my opinion, that doesn't help. It doesn't promote true mental health awareness or strategic understanding, but rather the solution piece, like, well, just take this pill and it'll be fine.
Well, even to get your therapy paid for, because many insurance, they need a diagnosis. So many insurance plans will have what they call behavioral health, and they'll give you maybe 12 sessions per year. And even to access that money from the insurance company that you pay into all the time to get your own money back, basically, you are going to have to, or your therapist will have to submit a diagnosis. And I remember when I was going through one of my really bad breakups and seeing my therapist back in Chicago, a woman named Tommy Atella, she's amazing. And because I knew this, and I did, of course, wanted to use my insurance because I was paying it. I said, so by the way, what are you going to diagnose me with? Because I didn't want some label that wasn't accurate. And she wouldn't have meant to say something or to assess me in a pejorative manner. But I also didn't want some trail of Karen has a history of depression.
You got to be really careful.
Because that's now part of my track record, so to speak. And I don't know if I would assume due to HIPAA that's not accessible to the average person. But even from my own understanding of my identity, I did not want that written down. I'm like, I'm going through a breakup. I'm grieving. I'm miserable. I thought I was going to have a future with this person. But
in order to get your therapy paid for, at least a portion, you had to play the game.
And I was fine with that because she said, I'm going to give you adjustment disorder. And I said, that works because I am adjusting to being in a relationship. The ones,
when I was running the wellness center as director, we tried to use GAD, generalized anxiety, or adjustment disorder. Occasionally, depression as a simple label. But it's really pretty frustrating. And when I'm teaching the graduate level classes for the counselors, I let them know up front, this is part of the game. And to always, if you have to do a label quickly, a diagnostic label quickly, pick something as generic as possible that feels like it fits with the client, but stress that we're working on holistic healing, not holistic naming, right? Because it can get very stuck on the idea that, oh, now this is the label. What meds do I take, or how do I live with this now rather than heal from it or grow through it? Just like I don't like people flipping around the ADHD term all the time, and just because they have a week where they're a little extra excitable or a little less focused, and they're like, I got ADHD now, and where's my Adderall? And just jumping into that kind of mindset rather than let's talk about coping, let's talk about strategies, let's talk about discipline and self-management and holistic nutrition and sleep and hydration and all those other factors. So that was tough because a lot of the therapists I hired at the wellness center when I came back to Justin to direct that were rookies because we couldn't afford veterans. And so they were fresh out of grad school and, wanting to do a really thorough, deep, appropriate diagnosis, which I was happy about. but we couldn't, we had to turn it in so quickly to get the insurance moving. You don't have time for 9 or 10 sessions to make appropriate staffing together as a group of counselors to walk through that. You got to do something quickly.
Well, and I also want to say here, because these eager beaver, and I remember in my master's assessment class, and I'm going to learn how to use the DSM and I'll be able to appropriately diagnose. And there's a little bit of, you feel kind of important now.
Absolutely.
I'm a professional and I can see things and understand things I felt that too. Like, oh, I'll be able to diagnose. And of course, over the years, as you go through, when we were in getting our masters in counseling and in clinical psych, it was the DSM-3R. And now we're up to the DSM-5. Are they calling it 5R? Okay. So all those different iterations, what I want to invite our community to understand, if they wouldn't, because how would they? It seems like it's a very useful tool. And this is what the DSM says. And so that's what the person has. Except it changes. It changes with the whims, with the trends. And it changes especially, as Dr. Alan Francis spoke about on this program way back the first year I was doing the podcast, it changes based on who's funding the DSM. And on the steering committee, I just saw an article, I think we talked about it. There were over 60 or 70% of the folks who were deciding what would be a mental disorder and what wouldn't be, had pharmaceutical ties, were being compensated by pharma. And again, so the urge, whether it's overt or covert, just based on the fact that when you're funded by an entity, you're going to frame your world, even as a professional, through that lens as well. And so when people feel that confidence, well, now I know what I have and it's in the DSM and my therapist said it. I just want to invite people to go, you don't have to step into that label. If that feels disempowering, which I think most labels do, don't own it. Go with, like you said, I mean, I don't have to name this and now how do I live with this forever? Because it's a fixed state I can never recover from.
Yeah, this is now me.
This is me.
This is something I'm going through.
Exactly. I like how you put it. Holistic healing. How do I heal from this? I can acknowledge it and recognize it as a challenge in this season of my life. I don't have to own it. Now I'm going to say the flip side, and I'm going to play devil's advocate because I want to hear what you think about this. Because when I've had this conversation in the past, and I used to team teach back at Chicago State, I would team teach with an anthropologist and a sociologist, and it was a really fun class and talking about the ways that we try to understand humans from our different fields. And the sociologist was a little bit more comfortable, I think, as sociologists tend to be, a little bit more comfortable with some of this, stepping into this identity. And he would say, a label, a diagnosis can actually feel very comforting for someone who goes, oh, wait, there's a name for this.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm not the only person who's ever experienced this. And in fact, other people, here's the path to address this. I would hope they would say heal from this. I'm not sure if they do necessarily, but there is a protocol in place for folks who are going through what I'm going through or emotionally experiencing what I'm experiencing.
Yeah, and I think it's very true. And I've had those moments with many, many clients where we talk through something and kind of are able to identify something that's in the textbooks or in the history or in the reading or new books. And it's super helpful. It does really feel some freedom. Like, oh my goodness, I was wondering what exactly I was feeling or identifying or understanding. But again, the point after that, which is great, there's nothing wrong with that, of course.
Right.
I have felt that myself with ADHD in high school and college the same way. So nothing wrong with that, but to have the mindset, oh, this doesn't now excuse or rationalize or justify my failures, my insecurities, my poor relationships with my wife or my kids or whatever, but rather this is now motivation to learn the most I can about this particular condition or disorder. And with some strategic help from a therapist who's growth-minded, that's a whole nother topic for conversation sometime.
Okay.
Because I think I can't get off target. Anyway, to have that kind of
I'm
mindset.
writing it down. I'm writing
Thank you.
it down.
Write down. We'll get back. Have that kind of mindset so that becomes a really effective and helpful tool, not a prison
tool.
cell.
Right. Oh, I like
So
that.
working
Tool
with-
versus prison cell. Go ahead.
Working with one of my favorite ADHD guys in Dallas, working with him last night again. And he was having a cycle where he's feeling very defeated by his ADHD. And so we spent a good half hour just drilling into that again to give him freedom to be himself outside of it.
Well, you've seen it as a gift in your life. We've talked about this extensively.
I have, but it took a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Dad recognized it as a gift early
For sure.
on.
And if I always think, what if I didn't have an ADHD dad who had learned
Right.
and who was by nature much more disciplined than I was at that stage. I think I have similar disciplines now. Like him, I get a ton done through nonstop discipline and structure and order.
And dad being a dissident by nature wasn't going to receive some label either. Or if he did even acknowledge it to some degree, I don't mean like dad wasn't running around like I'm ADHD. I mean, those terms weren't even used in his day.
Yeah, he wouldn't have cared anyway.
Yeah, and he would have, if he'd said, he'd been like, oh, that's just because I can spin a lot of plates. I can juggle a lot. Like, I can juggle a lot of things. He would have seen it as a strength because that's just how he was wired to frame toward empowerment and strength as opposed to weakness. But if we hadn't had that kind of dad, it would have been very easy to step into, like you said, a prison cell versus seeing a label that then became like, oh, okay, I'm not the only person who experiences this. Okay. And you've read, I mean, I know one of the books you've read is the whole thing is about how ADHD is actually a gift.
Absolutely.
Are you going to write that book too?
Happy, hyper, and healthy.
Yeah.
That's in there. If you could donate some more money to Judson to get me a whole free year of writing rather than teaching.
You need your sabbatical.
I don't know if we can have that. Psych department would be hurting. Although you're in the psych department now, so maybe I can just give you my classes. But
adjunct professor,
I do really feel some movement towards, I've been doing primarily speaking, teaching, conferencing things about marriage the last 5-6 years. And I really do feel desire to get back in the ADHD field a little bit and start driving into that. So maybe that'll be part of it.
Oh, good. Because then I'll come and I'll accompany you and I'll just rip on Adderall and Ritalin.
I'm teaching about tonight.
Vyvanse. And I will rip into it because it's speed and it's highly addictive.
Absolutely.
And when you're putting these little baby boys on it, and this is facts from Dr. Sachs again, at age 3, 5, 7, it alters their brain development such that it eventually, when they're in their late 20s, they have they have compromised motivational centers of their brain.
For sure. The dopamine is altered forever.
Right. And there's a particular part of the brain that now, again, is interesting. They try to kick up their motivation for studying and for paying attention and yet damage that. It's the nucleus accumbens it's a part of the brain. One
of the stats I give tonight on Adderall in particular, it's interesting. The curriculum and the notes from the grad school are done ahead of time. And, it was like 13 years ago. So when I go in and I'm reading through what I'm teaching tonight and then I adjusted, put my own videos in, Adderall wasn't even in the notes. So I went and jumped on a couple slides to get it in. And
really?
Yeah. Just because it was 13 years ago, it wasn't quite as hot yet. But anyway, one of the facts and stats I put in is that it's my computer's closed, but it talks about the research saying that 1 out of 4 college students uses Adderall for non-ADHD purposes. And it's extremely dangerous, way more dangerous than Ritalin was. And some of the other ones that were used to, high speed. Like you said, it's like essentially carrying cocaine in your pocket is what I tell moms when they're talking to me about that stuff.
I didn't know that is any different than Ritalin. Adderall's worse?
Well, that's what my notes were saying.
Oh, okay. I didn't know. Yeah. I want to say it's a Schedule 2 pharmaceutical. So, I mean, it's essentially speed. Yeah. It's
just like marijuana is still Schedule 1. And yet we still act like there's no health effects whatsoever that are negative for marijuana. But yet the government has not changed as far as law, Schedule 1 offense as a narcotic. So it's another side topic.
I know.
But in this whole because the schedules there are very similar, right, to DSM, they end up having enormous influence,
right,
in our court system and our punishments, our consequences, our jail, what's not jail, all that. I was on a grand jury for a long time, which was frustrating, but also really enlightening to hear as someone who teaches about drugs and everything, and to watch how that impacted.
What's number 3?
Yeah, number 3 to me is how our therapists are now trained. And it's a much more, just the way we even do our grad school at Judson. I love it. I think our Masters of Clinical Counseling is fantastic. But the whole aspect of accelerated programs, that started about 25 years ago, completely changed the modality of training our counselors. Okay. So I'm a part of this master's program. I adjunct once or twice a year, so I'm not like a main one, and I'm not criticizing any of our folks who are in there. They're great teachers. It's a good program. Anyone interested, please look it up online and join us. But the accelerated program and the style of teaching now that is getting more and more required by KCREP and other agencies that are our accreditation, and it's super important, dictate a much different style of learning. So I'm always amazed in my classes, for example, that there's not a lot of room for a lot of hands-on training experience that's different than just classroom training. I know this is getting really pragmatic or functional.
You're getting in the weeds with the field. I mean, we're getting deep into the psych.
So I'll quit going in the weeds for exactly about how it's taught. But what I think it's producing,
right?
I'll just go there. What I think it's producing, and what I saw a lot of the young counselors I was interviewing, or that I was observing counsel my family when my kids were going through a lot of stuff and difficult things with our foster kids, and where they were much more head oriented. Of course, that's brilliant. I'm glad they're smart. Head oriented, diagnostic oriented, and factual oriented, where I think a majority of the counselors who were in the field 40 years ago and starting, not that there wasn't brilliant academicians in there, but it was a much more, in my opinion, a much more relationally based journey process rather than a results diagnostic label movement.
Okay. So what you're saying is the training is so different that it's not as helpful? I mean, is that the crux of what you're saying?
I think because of the insurance, because of pharmaceuticals, because of all the things we've already talked about, I think it has shifted how counselors are trained, produced, created, and then so many of the agencies are so stuck in these routines because they have to be. I'm not blaming them. It's creating a different style of counseling to me, and I'm sure there's agencies that are doing it great, so I'm not criticizing the world here, that I think it's different. I just think the idea of this quick diagnostic, this quick labeling, and this quick medicating is now dominating our profession, which I don't believe was there 40 years ago.
I agree with you. So I guess what came to mind as you were talking was I was thinking about, you said holistic, more relationship based. So of course I go to Rogers, where you're just sitting with someone, giving them that reflective listening, holding a mirror up to them.
Positive regard and all the things he's famous for, yeah.
They can see themselves, assuming that they have the answers to their problems. Whereas the model we have now is, I'm going to give you a diagnosis. I have the answer to your problem, and it may be a pill, probably a pill. So that kind of thing. What I want to tease out here as well, because I know this is consistent with your philosophy as a psychotherapist, is that Rogerian holistic, more relationship based doesn't mean it's going to, in this case, it starts with Rogers, but it doesn't necessarily go non-directive, which Rogers always does.
Yeah.
You, as a professional, you have a more directive style.
Yeah,
your clients resonate with that.
Yeah,
so that's why I wanted to make sure that we got that sorted out, because at first I was like, oh, it's going to sound like he's saying there's no need for that more directive piece, and I know that that's not consistent with your philosophy.
No, crisis therapy, we're trained to be very directive.
Have to be.
Right, so it is. It's a more of a reflection, and I'm not anti-Rogers, even though it's not my style. And really, after Rogers came in and got big there in the 60s and 70s, every counselor in America was trained that way.
For sure.
And reflective listening, and there's some great principles there. His building rapport stuff is still absolutely fantastic. And even if you go watch videos of him today, it's like Mr. Rogers. He's just so kind and sweet.
I know, but it's powerful too.
Oh, absolutely.
It's surprising how, with his non-directive style, how much insight the client will get on their own. So I do love that. I like to start with that when I was teaching counseling skills and theories, because I want to remind, exactly to your point, I want to remind all these young professionals in training, it's not your job to figure this person's problems out. You are there to facilitate, to create an environment where they can figure out their own solutions. Because otherwise, we're not working ourselves out of a job, are we? We're creating dependency, which could be another factor that's going on here, because that's what all these diagnoses do. You have this thing, you're going to need these pills forever, you're going to need help always. It fosters dependency on the therapist. And I think some therapists are just good with that. They're okay with that. It's job security.
Yeah, so I think the changes we're talking about are subtle but significant. And so if we get into a results business and counseling, in my opinion, we're in trouble. That's not wise, it's not smart, and it's going to force you into, even more so than what the insurance and diagnostic might require anyway, to be that mindset, that perspective as a therapist, and not feel like, as Rogers would tell us, you're on a journey with the client, on a journey to let them go, to move them on, to give them their freedom and their own self-awareness, their own self-knowledge of learning. And I can't possibly think Rogers would be excited about where the American cultural labeling is gone. I don't think that's, the father of our current psychotherapy movement in America. I think he'd be very sad.
I think all of our fathers would be sad. I think Beck would be
Freud
sad.
might not be.
Freud
He's not American though, but
no,
yeah.
But Beck would be, Ellis would be outraged because he would think it's irrational to think that you're not going to go through periods of sadness and you're going to have periods. It's irrational to think you wouldn't have anxiety throughout any given week. The world's an uncertain place. And then none of these guys would be cool with this medicalized model.
Yeah, I don't think so.
None of them.
Yeah, so maybe maybe you just gave it the framework there off of point 2 is this medical model we talked about in point 2 has led to, in my opinion, as somebody who's been in the field now 35 straight years, it's changing the context and culture for the therapist. So I really felt, and I had every single therapist I had at Judson was fantastic. So I don't want any of them, if they listen for some reason, to feel like I'm judging them, but it felt a little bit like I had to deprogram them a tad.
Well, that's your
just
job.
To give them more freedoms again and give them more understanding. And sure, come chew things out with me, figure it out, walk through it. But let's not get so identified in it, even if we feel excited that we've helped them identify and understand, and we identify and understand, because then the goal is not to take what that label or that diagnostic is and go, now I champion this for my life.
Exactly. And I remember in therapy school, we were cautioned, like, your job is not to think that I'm going to help this client have this amazing insight, that I'm going to provide them with this insight. I've seen this about you. That's a very arrogant position. And again, it's disempowering. You're training the client then to think, I always need to go to professionals to figure out what's going on with me. Now, yes, we lean into professionals from time to time, but the goal is, as you were saying, is to help them, support them, provide them space and context to have that self-reflection and build their own self-confidence and build their own capabilities to move on.
Same is true in marital therapy. And I've had husbands or wives at times criticize the other spouse about, hey, do we have to have Elliott in our marriage? And they're right. No, you shouldn't. You shouldn't have to have me. I'm just a tool, a help, a processor, a builder, a healer, a grower. And the goal is obviously to hand it back completely and have them function stronger, wiser, smarter, spiritually, holistically on their own. And sure, I'm available occasionally for a check-in or an oil change, but the goal is not to have me be a part of their marriage for the rest of their life.
Mm-hmm. And you said something earlier, and I just want to make sure that we clarify this as well. You said something about results-oriented. Mm-hmm. So in that case, you're meaning results-oriented therapy that sounds like we don't want them to have any healing or growth.
No, but I'm very quick when when a client comes in and says something like, I'm depressed, I'd like to talk about it, or, I've been down. My first context of rapport building and understanding is let's just get you happy and on the way. Right? Because maybe, like you're saying, there's a really, really good reason to be depressed. And that happens a lot. Someone will tell me they've had like 5 major losses in their life in the last 2 months.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
And so the results here would be to make them happy.
Right.
And no longer be sad. And that would be ineffective therapy. I need to walk with them in their grief and help them maybe separate the grieving so they can heal each one as its own component and then comprehensively. And so maybe they leave with great understanding in 2 months. But when you have 5 major losses, including like parents dying and things like that, you're not going to be happy in 2 months. You might have emotions that are more stabilized and feel more secure and you don't feel dysfunctional, but the goal is not to make you happy.
Okay. I like that. Like, I just need to have that teased out for me. Also,
that's why I don't like language when it happens all the time in marriage counseling. They'll sit down and go, we just need you to fix us. I'm like, no, there's no fixing. We need to heal. We need to better understand. Yeah. We need to build engagement and rapport and strength, but we're not fixing things.
New dynamics.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and I also think that this medicalized model is so dehumanizing. It's so unempathic. And it's framed as like, well, we're going to help you because you've got a chemical imbalance. No, you went through 5 horrific losses. Mm-hmm. You are a human. who is in pain. And how cruel is it to say, oh no, you just got a neurotransmitter disorder. You just got chemical imbalance. Like, that is so cruel to me. And yet that is painted as like, I'm the cruel one because I'm putting up my hand to pharma. I'm the cruel one because people see my position, our position, as being less empathic to people's distress. And I'm thinking, no, I'm more empathic about your distress.
Yeah, one of the videos we're watching tonight is a perspective or a consideration about addiction, that it's not a disease model as much as the neurology gives very specified on that. It's not sociological or even family-based. It's a suffering-based perspective. A majority, this is a doctor who worked in Toronto in the heat of their drug culture for like 30 years. And he's like, I never met anyone who was in that condition that didn't have profound suffering from childhood, high school, and military, or whatever it might be. Just another component of that, the cognition of that. It's not like he's taking everything he's learned and throwing it out the window. He's just saying it's so much broader than that.
So we have, just to recap, we've talked extensively about the diagnosing and labeling and the unintended consequences therein, which has led also to a medicalized model, which we talked about in point 2 as an extension of that diagnostic approach. And then we've talked about number 3, that therapists, again, as another unintended consequence of this pervasive model throughout the culture, has then certainly infiltrated into the professionals in their current training and their approach. And so those are 3, I think, really important ways to understand what we're seeing. And
yet I still want to promote, I'm glad for this mental health awareness. Yeah. I'm glad it's out there more. I'm certainly not against that. I just think the consequences or the movements have made it maybe just as negative as positive.
So let's throw Dad in again, because we were told if something was wrong, we were told to get happy. We were told to fix it. And I think that older generation, when the next generation came along with so much attention to your feelings and so much attention to self-esteem and so much attention to, again, mental health awareness, which you just were speaking to, the impulse was a good one. There's importance behind it. At the same time, is there a place for just grinning and bearing it and just moving through something and not flipping talking about it ad nauseum all the time?
Yeah, I think for sure. I just don't know if that's what this culture at the moment is going to do. But I think those who do that, and the research supports it, just keep persevering, just keep engaging, just keep walking through, no matter how hard the suffering, how difficult. And there's a lot of biblical mandates to do that as well. So yes, I think you're right. There's grin and bear it is a funny term to me as well, because sometimes you need to bear it without grinning. But still, it's an interesting point. And the fix it mentality that I'm against in therapy as a son was extremely beneficial for me.
I know. When you said that, I was like, I got to bring up Dad here.
Yeah. So, and again, it's another, if anyone likes these kind of principles, please buy the book I wrote with Warren and Karen's help called Simon Says, where we take these principles. Our father was not a psychologist. He was like what I called a music sociologist. That's what I wrote about in the book, that he would take the principles of music and everything he knew there and then bring it into sociology and psychology. And he had a ton of psych and social books, if you remember his library. That's where I first started reading psych books. I started reading through them all the time. None of you guys knew it because I didn't want anybody to know I actually cared about something beyond sports and women. So it was that funny piece there. So, but I read a bunch of his stuff down there, and it was helping me too, helped me figure myself out. But in that context then, from what we're saying based on what you were reporting about my father, the get happy, the fix it, that's not what Andersons do. Things of those nature, right? What was I doing? Complaining or whining about something? That's not what Andersons do. Andersons lead, we don't follow. Right? Things like that. And that's funny to me, because what if we had 9 kids and 3 of them were non-leader type personalities?
I don't think that was going to be permitted.
Maybe it wasn't in the DNA. But I've certainly been with people who don't have leadership tendencies or spirit or perspective. But anyway, that's not the point at the moment. The point is just Dad's teaching and the requirement within the environment of our family context to march through, to live through, to heal through, to even have victories regardless of what the result was. Right? He was extremely competitive and wanted me to win every game I was ever in. But if I played the right way and led the right way and we lost, he could live with it.
Oh, yeah.
He might be irritated with the coaches if he thought they did something wrong, but he could live with it.
Storm off if the ref was making some bad calls. That totally happened at Miami Valley.
Right. But that was the context. So there's a lot of results business in there, right? He expected you and Warren to get straight A's, and you guys did. And he would not have tolerated C's. But when I got C's, he tolerated them because he knew for me the academic world was difficult, was challenging. And he kept telling me, your day's coming, you'll be fine. Your day's coming, you'll be fine. Just keep moving through. Get through the stuff that doesn't match you to get where you're going to match. So those are really important things that we can bring into therapy. And I think I do a good job of bringing that into my counseling. Here's the reality. Here's how it's causing you great distress or discouragement or dysfunction. But here's what we can do about it. Perspective, reframe, using cognitive behavior, rename, reclaim these things as your gift, like ADHD, like anxiety, even depression, whatever it is.
Well, and I remember going to a conference back when I was getting my doctorate, and there was a woman who'd done a ton of research on ruminating, and it is related to depression.
Absolutely.
So here you go with some of these approaches that are probably more current in the therapeutic modalities and contexts now would allow for a lot of ruminating. Again, I have depression and this is how I see the world and this is what I experienced this week and over again. And that's not helping. And that goes back to CBT again. If we sit there and indulge our cognitive distortions all day long, we will continue to be more and more depressed. So CBT says, no, you stop it.
Yeah, one of the exercises we do in interpersonal classes, I have them write down the things they love the most, 7 to 10, and then the things they hate the most or make them the most sad. And then when they're done, they talk about them, share them, and I go, okay, which one are you thinking more about? Are you thinking about these things you hate and that make you sad, or are you thinking about the things that you love and they're making good? That simple equation right there, to focus yourself on the things that are positive, like scripture tells us over and over, things that are pure and holy and true and right. Just focus on those things so that you're not ruminating on the reality of the world, which is a lot of sadness and darkness. And if we get stuck in those things, you will be impacted. You will start to carry that label and add a bunch of anger and add a bunch of insomnia and everything else on top of it.
And experience a lot of emotional distress and a lot of...
it's just going to carry through with you.
Maladaptive emotional experiences as well. And we're supposed to take captive every thought. So again, so that's not to minimize the pain. It's just to say, what am I going to do with it? And am I putting fuel onto my fire of my pain and my depression and my experiences, my sadness, my anxiety, whatever. Again,
so I think the opportunity to, due to this mental health awareness culture now,
that's a good.
The opportunity is great, but the opportunity to grow through that and learn through that is great. But the opportunity to also ruminate and get stuck and identify and label and get trapped is even greater.
And I want to remind our community that CBT, so these cognitive approaches, that if Dad were a psychologist, he would have been a cognitive psychologist, because it was all about taking charge of your thoughts and taking charge of your life. It's all about making it happen.
It could be more analytical and a little less emotional for him, because
that was more his style.
Difficult wounds in the emotional realm that was not as easy for him.
But I remember going through, again, when I was starting my clinical psych master's and starting with Rogers, as you often do in a program of courses in these programs, just going, oh my gosh, Dad didn't always validate every emotion I had. Oh my goodness. I remember thinking, he told me to get happy. How could he? Then I get to my cognitive class. I'm like, he was onto something.
It's really a bit of both and.
Yeah.
So, all right, as we wrap up, I think we have, I hope through this conversation, come to at least some of our impressions or interpretations of what's going on. And obviously, as you are a current therapist, I'm a former therapist, we are pro therapy always.
Absolutely.
Yet, and again, this is something that we've talked about in the program before, we do want to be very mindful. And when people ask me, and over the years they've reached out, even from Instagram followers and so forth, what kind of therapist? And right away, I'm always, let's start with cognitive. The research shows that it's the most effective, more effective than medication. if we're dealing with a family relationship, let's go to family therapy, which isn't done as often as I would love for it to be done. With children, I just don't even think it's really worth it to have an 8-year-old in therapy by themselves. They need to be in that family context.
Finishing on this application, I think you were moving on. I think we need to be even more picky.
Yes.
And more particular about what therapists we use.
Yes.
And even if it feels a decent amount of effectiveness, but something feels off, or you feel like you're more like a number, or they're treating you more as a diagnosis and shifting you on to medication immediately, I would just go to a different counselor. Don't feel trapped that you have. And if this counselor was great for your friend, but doesn't feel great with you, move to another one. Don't feel like this dependency or this need to follow a norm if the norm is not good for you.
And there's been a lot of research on this too, that the good therapeutic fit between the client and the therapist is probably the most powerful element of therapy.
Absolutely.
And then I would also, just to mind, body, and spirit this thing as we wrap up, if you're not seeing a holistic therapist, I don't think you're going to have lasting healing. If you're not addressing your diet, if you're not getting your vitamin D, if you're not getting exercise, if you're not spending time in nature, if you're not in a relationship with God, I don't see all these therapeutic tools and interventions may be fine and maybe offer some relief and some healing, but I don't think we move through this life without addressing the mind, body, and spirit, which is why that is the foundation of this podcast.
Yep. So be picky in particular and keep working and looking and praying until you find the right one for you.
All right. Well, thanks for responding to that, because that's been on my mind. And I was like, I want to bring this to Elliott and I want us to unpack it a little bit, this trend that we're seeing. So let's pray for some powerful therapists with true, deep, and lasting healing.
All right, Lord, we are thankful for this mental health awareness in the culture and the community, really across the world. And we know it's helped millions and millions of people. But Lord, there's some danger and risk with it, with over-identification and the labeling, the medical model, the feeling that, Lord, this isn't something to grow and learn and heal and move beyond, maybe in some cases, or move through, but rather often gets people stuck and feeling discouraged and rooting their identity in something that is not of you and holistically of their future. And so we're thankful for diagnosis. We're thankful for the things that can help and be of benefit, but we're also cautious about it and careful about it. And within the therapeutic realm, Lord, we're asking for the counselors to be wise and holistic and integrative, and to be inspired, to join people, to walk with them, to build that rapport and that understanding, that appreciation, acceptance, and to help people take hold of their lives in a way that can give them empowerment and engagement and encouragement and inspiration to be their best self and to move through life truly healthy, happy, and whole. And so we thank you, Lord, for the chance to talk through this morning. In your name, amen.